Maya Williams stepped off the bus, gripping the straps of her backpack, and stared up at the towering front entrance of Clearview High School in Houston, Texas. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of freshly cut grass, mingling with the faint warmth that's still lingering from the summer heat. Students moved in clusters, their laughter and casual conversations filling the air around her. But Maya felt out of place, like an outsider. She wasn't new to the experience of starting over. This was her fourth transfer in just 3 years. Some kids moved because their parents got new jobs. Maya moved because she needed a fresh start. Again. She kept her head down, walking toward the main doors, hoping to blend in, to become just another face in the crowd. A few students glanced at her curiously, but she avoided their eyes. Clearview High wasn't anything extraordinary. It was a large suburban school filled with middle-class kids who had known each other since kindergarten. The football team was decent, the cheer squad was popular, and the social hierarchy had been established long before Maya arrived. But none of that mattered to her. She had one goal: stay invisible. The hallway buzzed with energy. Lockers slammed shut, sneakers squeaked against the tile floors, and teachers tried to corral students into their classrooms before the first bell rang. Maya walked down the hallway, clutching her schedule. This routine was familiar to her. Find her locker, figure out where she would sit at lunch, and, most importantly, identify the kids she needed to stay away from. And that was when she saw him. Bryce Carter, tall and broad-shouldered, with an effortless confidence that only the most popular, untouchable guys in high school possessed. He leaned against a row of lockers, surrounded by a group of boys wearing Letterman jackets, each laughing at something he had just said. Even from a distance, Maya could see the aura of control around him, the kind that made people either follow him or fear him. Maya recognized his type. Bryce was the golden boy. Star quarterback, good looks, a wealthy family. But there was something else, something darker. The way the students around him laughed just a little too hard, the way they shifted their weight nervously when he spoke. Maya had met kids like Bryce before, bullies who thrived on power and intimidation. She didn't plan on drawing his attention, but fate had other ideas. As she walked past, someone bumped into her shoulder. It wasn't an accident. Her books tumbled to the floor, scattering across the hallway. A few students turned to watch, some snickering. Maya bent down quickly, trying to ignore the heat rising in her cheeks. "Well, well, what do we have here?" A calm, amused voice cut through the air. Maya froze. She didn't have to look up to know whose voice it was. Bryce Carter. His voice was smooth, mocking, but there was an edge to it, like a lion toying with its prey. Maya heard his friends chuckling behind him. Slowly she looked up. Bryce stood over her, arms crossed, wearing that infuriating smirk she had seen on the faces of bullies who ruled the school. "I don't think I've seen you before," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. Maya didn't answer. She just grabbed her books, stood up, and brushed past him without a word. But Bryce wasn't done. "Hey, where's your manners?" he called out, his voice carrying through the hallway. "I asked you a question." Maya didn't react. She had played this game before. The best way to deal with people like him was to not engage. But Bryce didn't like being ignored. She felt a sharp tug on her backpack, pulling her back just slightly. Not enough to hurt, but enough to let her know he wasn't letting this go. Maya stopped. Slowly she turned around. The hallway seemed to grow quieter. Even the students who hadn't been paying attention before had started to watch. She met Bryce's gaze, and for the first time, something flickered in his eyes. Curiosity, maybe even surprise. "You shouldn't have done that," Maya said quietly. Bryce raised an eyebrow, then laughed, a slow, mocking laugh. "And why is that?" Maya didn't answer. She just held his gaze, unflinching. Bryce tilted his head. "You're kind of weird, you know that." A few chuckles rippled from his friends. Maya turned her back on him and walked away, knowing he wasn't finished with her yet. But for the first time, she wasn't afraid. She had been here before, and she knew exactly how this would go. The power had shifted. Bryce had no idea what kind of mistake he had just made. This is the start of Maya's journey. What begins as a simple encounter with the school bully is about to unfold into something much bigger. Maya's secret, her strength, and her patience will soon come to the forefront, and Bryce will learn that not all bullies are as invincible as they seem. Stay tuned for the next chapter. The rest of Maya's first day at Clearview High felt like a blur. She stuck to the back of the classroom, answering only when necessary, avoiding eye contact with the other students. At lunch, she sat alone in a corner, near the edge of the cafeteria, where she could watch without being watched. Bryce and his friends, as expected, ruled the lunchroom. They took up the biggest table in the center, talking loudly, laughing as if the world revolved around them. Every once in a while, Maya would feel his eyes flicker toward her, but he didn't approach. Not yet. By the time the last bell rang, Maya was relieved to finally escape. The Houston heat was still strong, making the pavement shimmer as she walked toward the bus stop. She reached for her phone when she heard a voice behind her. "Hey, new girl!" Maya froze. She turned around to see Bryce standing a few feet away, hands in his pockets, a grin still plastered on his face. Behind him, a few of his friends lingered, waiting. Maya sighed. "What do you want?" Bryce took a slow step forward, his grin widening. "You've got an attitude problem, you know that?" Maya didn't respond. She simply watched him, her expression unreadable. Bryce smirked, then took another step closer, his voice taking on a mocking tone. "What? You think you're better than me?" Maya's lips curled into a small, amused smile. She let out a short laugh. "Not really," she said, her voice calm. "I just think you should walk away." Bryce faltered for half a second, but quickly recovered. "Oh, yeah?" His smirk deepened. "And why is that?" Maya leaned in slightly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because you have no idea who I am." Bryce's cocky grin faltered, then twisted into a skeptical laugh. "And who are you exactly?" Maya didn't answer. Instead, she pressed a button on her phone. A loud, roaring engine filled the air. A sleek, black Dodge Charger Hellcat pulled up next to the curb, the kind of car that made heads turn. The tinted window rolled down slowly, and there, sitting behind the wheel, was none other than Vin Diesel. Bryce's smirk vanished in an instant. His eyes widened as he glanced between Maya and the unmistakable figure sitting in the driver's seat of the car. His mouth opened and closed like he wanted to say something, but no words came out. Maya didn't miss a beat. She turned to Bryce, a small, satisfied smile playing on her lips. "Still think I'm weird?" she asked. Bryce didn't answer. He stood there, frozen, his jaw clenched. The once confident school king was now standing small in front of her. He was the one who was unsure, the one who didn't know what to do next. Maya didn't wait. She walked past him, past the stunned silence of the crowd that had gathered, and slid into the passenger seat of the car. Vin Diesel didn't say anything at first. He simply shifted the car into gear, and the Charger let out a low growl as it pulled away from the curb. As they drove off, the high school building fading behind them, Maya let out a small breath. She had never intended to make such a scene, but she wasn't going to let Bryce think he could intimidate her. Vin kept his eyes on the road, tapping his fingers rhythmically on the steering wheel. The silence between them was comfortable. Finally, Maya spoke. "That was kind of dramatic, wasn't it?" She laughed softly. Vin's lips curled into his signature half-smile. "A little," he agreed. Maya glanced out the window, watching the city of Houston blur past them. "I didn't mean for them to find out like that." Vin glanced at her. "What would have been a better way? Letting some punk like that walk all over you?" Maya shrugged. "I wasn't going to let him walk all over me," she said softly. "I was just waiting." Vin raised an eyebrow. "For what?" "The right moment," Maya said with a smile. Vin chuckled softly, glancing at her. "You've got patience. I like it." Maya leaned back in the seat, a quiet satisfaction filling her chest. She had just sent a message to Bryce, one he would never forget. But even though she had won the first round, she knew it wasn't over yet. Bryce wasn't the type to let things slide. And now that he had a taste of what Maya was capable of, he wouldn't back down so easily. The next day, Maya walked into Clearview High with a calm resolve. She could feel the whispers before she even set foot in the building. They were different today. Yesterday, people had whispered about the girl who had Vin Diesel pick her up in a muscle car. Today, they whispered about what had happened to her locker. As Maya walked down the hallway, she could hear students talking in hushed tones. Some were curious, some amused, and others just plain intrigued. Maya didn't care. She had already decided that Bryce Carter was not worth her time. He could play his games, but she knew how to play this better. When lunchtime arrived, Maya grabbed her tray and sat at her usual spot in the cafeteria. She knew Bryce would be watching. She could feel his eyes on her, even though she didn't look his way. Then, just as expected, Bryce made his move. "Hey, Maya," he called out loudly, his voice carrying across the cafeteria. "Still crying about your little locker?" Maya didn't flinch. She didn't even look up. She just grabbed a fork and continued eating, as if nothing had happened. Bryce wasn't done, though. He took it up a notch. "Guess you can't handle it, huh?" he yelled. "Maybe your big bad daddy should come fight your battles for you." Maya finally looked up, locking eyes with him. Her expression was calm, unbothered. "It's funny," she said, her voice cool. "You keep bringing up my dad, like you're not the one who almost pissed himself when he saw him." The cafeteria fell silent. Bryce's friends exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of how to react. Maya didn't wait for Bryce to speak. She went back to her food unfazed, but she could feel the shift. Bryce wasn't the one in control anymore, and this was only the beginning. The next morning, the tension at Clearview High was palpable. Maya walked through the hallway, aware of the hundreds of eyes following her every move. Whispers filled the air like wildfire. But instead of shrinking away, Maya straightened her shoulders and walked with her head held high. She wasn't just the new girl anymore. She was a force to be reckoned with. Bryce hadn't made his move yet, but she knew it was coming. That's how he worked. When his pride was wounded, he fought back. And Maya had just wounded his pride in front of the entire school. The day passed in a blur of uneasy glances and hushed conversations. In every class, students stared at her when they thought she wasn't looking. Some looked at her with admiration, others with skepticism, but none of them dared to approach her. At lunch, Maya took her usual spot near the edge of the cafeteria, but this time, the air felt different. The silence around her was thick, almost suffocating. She could feel the eyes of Bryce's friends on her, watching her every move. Bryce, however, wasn't there. Maya thought it was strange, but she didn't dwell on it. She picked at her lunch, trying to tune out the whispers that seemed to follow her everywhere. That was until she felt the weight of someone's presence looming over her. "Princess," a voice sneered from above. Maya looked up to see Ryan, one of Bryce's goons, standing in front of her. His arms were crossed, a smirk stretching across his face as if he'd just won a small victory. "Did you miss me?" he asked, his voice dripping with condescension. Maya didn't respond. She simply took another bite of her food, trying to ignore him. Ryan's grin widened. "Guess you're still too scared to talk," he said. "You know, it's kind of pathetic how quickly you folded. Thought you were tougher than that." Maya's hand tightened around her fork. She didn't flinch, but the heat rising in her chest was hard to ignore. She had been here before. Bullies who thought they could break her with words, with actions. She had dealt with them in the past. But this time was different. She wasn't just going to let them get to her. With a deep breath, Maya put her fork down and looked up at Ryan, her gaze calm but firm. "You think you can intimidate me with words?" she asked quietly. "That's cute." Ryan stepped closer, leaning over her with a mock-threatening expression. "I'm not the one you need to worry about, Princess," he said, his voice low. "Bryce is the one you should be scared of." Maya met his eyes, unflinching. "I'm not scared of Bryce," she replied, her voice steady. "I'm not scared of anyone." Ryan's smile faltered for a split second, but he quickly recovered. "You should be," he muttered, turning on his heel and walking away. As he left, Maya couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. They were all just trying to push her buttons, hoping to get a rise out of her. But she wasn't going to give them the satisfaction. Not this time. The rest of the day passed without incident, but Maya could feel the shift in the air. Bryce had retreated for the moment, but Maya knew it was only temporary. He wasn't the type to back down easily, especially after being humiliated by her in front of his friends. Sure enough, when the bell rang at the end of the day and Maya was heading to her locker, she found that her worst fear had come true. Her locker had been trashed. Books were thrown across the floor, papers crumpled and scattered. The metal door was covered in angry scribbles of permanent marker. Words of cruelty scrawled across the surface. It was an obvious message. "You don't belong here." Maya sighed deeply, her heart pounding in her chest, but she didn't let it show. She had expected this. Bryce had made his move. Students gathered around watching her every move, none of them daring to help. They just stood there, waiting to see what she would do. Maya bent down slowly, picking up her books one by one, stacking them neatly. She didn't flinch, didn't let her anger show. She didn't let Bryce see how much it bothered her. When she finished, she stood up, grabbed her backpack, and walked toward her locker. She didn't even glance at Bryce or his friends who were standing a few feet away, watching her intently. She shut her locker with a soft click and walked away without a word. But Bryce wasn't done. He had pushed, and now he was waiting for her to break. That night at home, Maya sat at the kitchen table, her fingers tapping lightly against the wood. Vin Diesel stood by the counter, arms crossed, watching her. "They trashed my locker today," she said finally, her voice calm but heavy with the weight of the day's events. Vin raised an eyebrow. "That their best move?" Maya smirked, though her eyes remained distant. "For now," she replied. Vin studied her for a moment before walking over and sitting down across from her. "So, what's your move?" Maya exhaled slowly, her thoughts racing. "I'm not going to do anything yet. I'm going to let him dig his own grave." Vin's lips twitched in a smile. "I like the way you think." "I know how this works," Maya continued, her gaze unwavering. "Guys like Bryce, they push, and when they push, they get reckless. I'm not going to make the first mistake. I'm going to wait." Vin leaned back in his chair, nodding. "Smart. That's exactly how it works. Let him dig himself in deeper, and when the time's right, you'll strike." Maya smiled, the tension slowly easing from her shoulders. "Exactly." The next day, Maya walked into school with a quiet confidence. The whispers were still there, but this time they felt different. People were starting to take notice, not of her vulnerability, but of her resilience. She wasn't the girl Bryce thought she was. She wasn't the quiet new girl who could be intimidated into silence. She was playing the long game, and Bryce had no idea what was coming next. When lunchtime arrived, Maya took her usual seat at the back of the cafeteria. She was aware of the eyes that followed her, but she didn't care. Bryce hadn't made his move yet, but she knew he would. She was ready. As she ate her lunch, she felt a presence beside her. This time it was Bryce himself. "Nice locker," he sneered, his voice loud enough for nearby students to hear. Maya didn't look up. She simply took another bite of her food. "I know you're not scared of me," Bryce continued, his tone mocking, "but you should be. I don't take kindly to people who try to embarrass me." Maya slowly put her fork down, finally looking at him. "You're not as tough as you think," she said quietly, "and one day, you'll realize that." Bryce clenched his jaw, clearly frustrated. He had expected to provoke her, but all he had done was get under his own skin. Without another word, he turned and stormed away, his friends trailing behind him. Maya watched them go, the faintest smirk on her lips. She didn't need to fight him, not yet. Bryce was already losing, and soon he'd destroy himself. The next day, the tension at Clearview High was thicker than ever. Bryce had pushed Maya's buttons, but this time, he'd made a mistake. He underestimated her, and Maya wasn't going to let that slide. She walked into the school with a calm resolve, aware that everything was shifting. The whispers had intensified, but instead of retreating into herself, she walked with her head held high. The moment she stepped into the hallway, she could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on her. They weren't just watching the girl who had Vin Diesel pick her up in a muscle car. Now they were watching the girl who had embarrassed the king of the school. The social dynamics were shifting, and Bryce could feel it. He wasn't in control anymore, and that scared him. Maya kept her pace slow and steady, ignoring the whispers that followed her every step. She made her way to her locker, her fingers brushing the metal as she opened it. The damage from the day before was still fresh in her mind. The cruel, ugly messages scrawled on her locker door. It had taken everything in her not to let her anger show. She wasn't going to give Bryce that satisfaction. As she was putting away her books, she caught sight of Bryce. He stood across the hallway leaning against the lockers with his usual crew of friends. But this time, he wasn't laughing. He was watching her. His eyes were narrowed, his jaw clenched. But there was something else there now. Something that hadn't been there before. It was the first crack in his armor. Maya held his gaze for a moment, then, without a word, she turned and walked away. She knew Bryce was watching, but she refused to give him a reaction. She wasn't the one who needed to prove anything. The day passed without incident, but Maya could feel the storm brewing. She knew Bryce wasn't done with her. He wouldn't be. He wasn't the type to back down, especially not after his pride had been hurt. But Maya had learned something crucial over the last few days. Bryce wasn't the untouchable king he thought he was. He was just a bully, and bullies always make mistakes. At lunch, Maya took her usual spot, quietly eating her food and watching the crowd. She felt Bryce's eyes on her again, but this time she didn't care. She wasn't going to be intimidated by him or his friends. She knew he was looking for a reaction, but she wasn't going to give him the satisfaction. That was when Ryan, one of Bryce's friends, approached her. He had always been one of the more outspoken of the group, and today was no different. "You think you're some kind of hero now?" He sneered, his voice low but full of venom. Maya didn't look up. She just continued eating, her expression neutral. "I'm not a hero," she said calmly. "I'm just not going to let people like you walk all over me." Ryan took a step closer, his chest puffed up. "You're nothing, just a little girl who got lucky. Bryce is going to make you regret this." Maya's grip on her fork tightened, but she didn't respond. She knew Ryan was trying to get under her skin, but it wasn't going to work. Instead of arguing, she just continued eating, her calmness only serving to infuriate him further. "You think you're so tough," Ryan muttered, his voice dripping with disdain. "But you're nothing, just a scared little girl who doesn't know her place." Maya slowly set her fork down and looked up at him. "You don't know me, Ryan," she said quietly, her voice laced with a calm confidence. "But you're about to find out." Ryan's eyes narrowed as he took a step back. Maya could feel the tension building, but she remained unshaken. She had already won. She knew Bryce was watching this, and he would be furious. She wasn't playing his game anymore. He had pushed, but now it was her turn. By the time the final bell rang, Maya knew that things had escalated. The hallway was buzzing with rumors, and she could feel the stares from every direction. Students were no longer whispering about the girl who had Vin Diesel pick her up. They were whispering about the girl who had dared to stand up to Bryce Carter. Maya wasn't worried. She had dealt with this before. People talking behind her back, underestimating her. It was nothing new, but this time, she wasn't going to let them take her down. She wasn't going to let Bryce control her. As she made her way to her locker, Maya noticed a crowd had gathered. Bryce's friends were hanging around, laughing and talking in hushed tones. But there was one person missing, Bryce. He wasn't there, and Maya couldn't help but wonder if he was planning something. Her thoughts were interrupted when she heard a voice behind her. It was Ryan again, but this time, he wasn't alone. "Hey, Maya," he called out, a smug smile on his face. "Looks like your little plan backfired." Maya turned to face him, and that was when she saw it. Her locker door was covered in new messages. Words like loser and nobody were scrawled in black marker, the writing harsh and ugly. It was clear that Bryce had taken his revenge. For a moment, Maya felt a flash of anger, but she quickly pushed it down. She had expected this. Bryce wasn't the type to let things slide. He had just made a big mistake, though. He had pushed too far, and now it was her turn to make him pay. She stood there for a moment, staring at the messages, and then she did something that surprised everyone. She didn't scream, didn't cry, didn't lash out. She simply reached into her backpack, pulled out a wet cloth, and started wiping the marks off her locker. The crowd watched her, stunned. "What are you doing?" Ryan sneered. Maya didn't look up as she continued cleaning the door. "I'm doing what I should have done yesterday," she said quietly. "I'm not letting him win." As she finished cleaning the locker, she stood up, wiped her hands on her jeans, and turned to face the group of students who had gathered. "I'm not afraid of you, Bryce," she said calmly, her voice carrying through the hallway. "And I'm not afraid of anyone." She walked away, leaving them all in stunned silence. That night, Maya sat at the kitchen table, feeling a sense of calm wash over her. Vin Diesel leaned against the counter, watching her closely. "You did good today," he said with a proud smile. Maya smiled back, though there was a hint of exhaustion in her eyes. "It's not over yet." Vin's smile faded. "No, it's not. But you're ready now. You've got him right where you want him." Maya nodded slowly. "I'm letting him dig his own grave. He's already made the first mistake. Now he's going to make more. She knew Bryce was going to try to fight back. But what he didn't realize was that the more he pushed, the closer he was getting to his own downfall. Maya had learned something important over the last few days. Bullies like Bryce didn't just hurt people, they hurt themselves. And as long as she stayed calm, stayed patient, Bryce would destroy himself. Maya just had to sit back and wait for him to make his next move. And when he did, she would be ready. The morning after Maya had wiped the marker off her locker, she knew something had shifted. The whispers had become louder, more frequent. She walked through the halls of Clearview High, her steps confident, unhurried, as the students around her paused their conversations when she passed. She could feel their eyes on her, but she didn't flinch. If Bryce and his group thought they could break her, they had another thing coming. Maya had learned long ago that the best way to handle a bully was to take away their power. Bryce had tried to intimidate her with his arrogance and his friends, but what he didn't realize was that she was no longer afraid of him. The tables were turning, and soon everyone would see Bryce for who he really was. The day seemed to drag on, with Maya dodging the usual taunts and jabs from Bryce's goons. Ryan and a couple of other players from the football team had tried to provoke her, but she kept her cool, refusing to let their words get under her skin. The more she ignored them, the more frustrated they became. At lunch, Maya sat at her usual spot, away from the chaos in the middle of the cafeteria. She had learned to embrace her solitude. It gave her the space to think and observe, to watch how the drama around her unfolded. Bryce was there too, sitting with his friends, looking smug as usual, but there was a noticeable change in his behavior. His eyes flickered to Maya every now and then, but this time, there was no mocking smile, no confidence. There was only a glimmer of something else, fear. Maya didn't know if he was scared of her or scared of what he knew was coming, but whatever it was, it made him uneasy. That was a victory in itself. After lunch, Maya headed to her next class. As she walked down the hallway, she felt a familiar presence behind her. This time, it was Bryce. He had his usual entourage with him, but there was something different about him today. He wasn't playing the role of the king anymore. There was a crack in his armor. "Maya," Bryce's voice called out, his tone sharp and cold. Maya turned slowly, her eyes locking onto his. "I need to talk to you," he said, his friends hanging back, sensing the shift in power. Maya tilted her head slightly, her lips curving into a small, knowing smile. "About what?" she asked, her voice calm, unbothered. "Are you still upset about your locker?" Bryce's jaw tightened, and for the first time, Maya saw him struggle to maintain his control. He had always been the one to hold the power, to dictate the way things went. But now Maya was the one in control. "You think you can just walk around here, acting like you own the place?" he snapped. "You think you're some big deal now, because you had Vin Diesel pick you up? Is that it?" Maya's gaze never wavered. "I don't need Vin Diesel to make me feel powerful, Bryce," she said quietly, her voice unwavering. "And I don't need to act like I own the place. I just don't need people like you trying to run it." Bryce took a step forward, but there was hesitation in his movements. He was used to intimidating people, making them back down. But Maya wasn't backing down. She was standing tall, and it was beginning to rattle him. "You don't belong here," he growled. "You never will." Maya smiled softly, a cool, almost predatory smile. "You're wrong," she said. "I belong exactly where I am. You're the one who doesn't belong, Bryce, and soon everyone will see it." Bryce's eyes narrowed, his fists clenching at his sides. For a brief moment, Maya thought he might try to strike her. But then the bell rang, signaling the end of the conversation. Bryce didn't say another word. He turned and walked away, his footsteps heavy with frustration. Maya stood there watching him go, a sense of satisfaction filling her chest. The battle wasn't over yet, but the scales had tipped in her favor. The next morning, the air at Clearview High felt different. The students were still whispering, but it wasn't about Maya anymore. They were whispering about Bryce. It seemed that the cracks in his image were starting to show. Word had spread quickly. Maya had held her ground, and now Bryce was the one who looked weak. By lunchtime, Maya was sitting at her usual spot, watching as Bryce's friends started to drift away. One by one, They seemed to be distancing themselves from him. The same group of guys who had once followed him like sheep were now looking at him with doubt in their eyes. Some even whispered behind his back, no longer laughing at his jokes. And then it happened. Maya watched as Bryce stood up from his table, his face flushed with anger. He had had enough. He was used to being the center of attention, and this time it was all slipping away from him. He scanned the room, his eyes landing on her. "You're still here," he shouted, his voice cracking with frustration. "You still think you can beat me? You're nothing, Maya." Maya didn't flinch. She didn't even look at him. She just kept eating her lunch, as if she couldn't care less about his outburst. Bryce stormed over to her, his hands balled into fists. He was shaking with rage, but Maya remained calm, completely unfazed. She could feel the eyes of the entire cafeteria on her, but she didn't care. She knew what was coming. Bryce stood over her, breathing heavily. "What's it going to be, huh? You want to fight me too?" Maya looked up at him, her expression cool and collected. "No, Bryce," she said, her voice steady. "I don't want to fight you. I just want you to leave me alone." There was a brief moment of silence as Bryce processed her words. His eyes flickered with confusion, followed by anger. But there was something else there too, a flicker of doubt. For the first time, Bryce wasn't sure of himself. And in that moment, Maya knew that he had lost. The once feared king of Clearview High had been dethroned, not by violence, but by his own insecurity and the simple truth that Maya had been able to expose. She didn't need to fight back with physical force. She had already won by refusing to be afraid. Bryce's jaw tightened, and without saying another word, he turned and stormed out of the cafeteria. The students watched him go, the silence in the room thick with anticipation. Maya sat back in her chair, a small smile on her lips. She hadn't expected him to go this far, but it didn't matter. He had played his hand, and now he was finished. Later that night, Maya sat at the kitchen table, her fingers tapping rhythmically against the wood. She had won. Bryce had pushed, but she hadn't broken. The power had shifted, and there was no going back. Vin Diesel sat across from her, studying her closely. "You did good today," he said, his voice soft but proud. "You've got him on the ropes." Maya nodded, her smile faint but knowing. "It's not over yet," she said, "but I'm ready for whatever he throws at me next." Vin leaned back in his chair, a grin tugging at the corners of his lips. "You've got this. You're one step ahead of him." Maya glanced out the window, her thoughts swirling. She had done it. She had faced the bully, the arrogant king of the school, and come out on top. But she knew the game wasn't over. Bryce still had a few tricks up his sleeve. But whatever he did next, Maya was ready. Because she knew that sometimes the best way to fight back wasn't with force, it was with patience, intelligence, and the quiet power that came from within. Maya walked through the hallways of Clearview High like she owned them. It had been a few days since the showdown in the cafeteria, and the whispers about Bryce had only intensified. Everywhere she went, students looked at her with a mix of admiration, respect, and curiosity. No one feared Bryce anymore. And it wasn't just because of Vin Diesel's brief appearance. It was because they had all seen Maya stand her ground, hold her head high, and refuse to let the bully win. Bryce had tried everything. He had used intimidation, humiliation, and threats. But Maya had done something different. She didn't lash out. She didn't fight back with the same anger he had shown. She simply waited, watched, and let him unravel himself. Maya had no illusions about what Bryce had been. He had been a bully, feeding off the fear and respect others had for him. But when that fear was taken away, when people saw through the mask he wore, he became nothing more than a hollow shell. Today was the day Maya would make sure everyone knew that for good. At lunch, Maya sat down at her usual spot, feeling the weight of the students' eyes on her. It had been a while since Bryce had come close to her, but she knew he was still plotting. He always would be. He couldn't let go of the fact that someone had taken his crown without throwing a single punch. Sure enough, just as Maya was about to take a bite of her sandwich, she saw Bryce storming into the cafeteria. His face was flushed, his hands clenched into fists. He was alone this time, and he didn't have the usual bravado in his stride. He looked desperate. Maya didn't flinch. She didn't even look at him. She continued eating, as if his presence didn't matter to her. Bryce stopped in front of her, his breathing heavy. "What's it going to take, Maya?" he spat, his voice shaking with fury. "You keep humiliating me. You think I'm going to just let you walk all over me?" Maya took her time before responding, her voice calm, unwavering. "You're the one who keeps pushing, Bryce. All I've done is stand up for myself. But you've made this whole thing about you, about your ego." Bryce's fists clenched harder, but his eyes flickered with uncertainty. For the first time, Maya saw the fear in him. It wasn't about her anymore. It was about him realizing that he had no control over her, no power over the situation. Maya stood up slowly, her eyes locked on his. "You've already lost, Bryce. And the worst part is, you'll never even know how. You're so busy trying to tear people down, you never stop to wonder when your own house of cards would come tumbling down." She turned to leave, but before she did, she added, "No one's afraid of you anymore, Bryce. You're just a kid trying to hide behind a mask, and everyone sees it now." Bryce stood frozen, his face pale, his jaw tight. The crowd in the cafeteria had grown silent, watching as the mighty fallen king realized what had just happened. Maya hadn't even raised a finger. She had simply pointed out the truth, and that truth was Bryce's downfall. As Maya walked out of the cafeteria, the murmurs from the students grew louder. Bryce Carter had lost everything. His friends, his reputation, his power, everything was slipping through his fingers. Epilogue, the lesson. The story of Maya Williams and Bryce Carter didn't end with a dramatic fight or some grand gesture of revenge. It ended with something far more powerful. The realization that true strength doesn't come from making others feel small, and that power built on fear is never lasting. Maya had spent most of her life moving from school to school, trying to blend in, trying to survive. She had learned to keep her head down, to avoid conflict, and to remain unnoticed. But when she encountered Bryce, something shifted within her. She realized that the best way to face a bully wasn't to cower in fear, but to stand tall in your truth. Maya's victory was not in defeating Bryce physically or embarrassing him in front of everyone. It was in staying true to herself, in refusing to let his cruelty define her. She understood that bullies only had power because we gave it to them. Once she stopped being afraid, Bryce had nothing left. For Bryce, the lesson was a hard one. The arrogance, the mocking, the need for control, it all came crashing down when people stopped fearing him. And in that moment, he realized that the power he had once relied on was nothing but an illusion. The lesson from this story is simple. True power comes from within, from knowing who you are, and from standing firm in your values. Bullies only thrive when we give them our fear. When we take that fear away, their power disappears. And in the end, it is the quiet ones, the ones who refuse to be controlled, who change everything. Maya wasn't a hero because she had a powerful ally, or because she fought back with fists. She was a hero because she stood her ground, chose patience over anger, and let truth be her weapon. Bryce was a reminder that the loudest voice in the room doesn't always win. Sometimes the quietest one has the most power. And as Maya walked out of the school that day, she didn't need anyone to tell her that she had won. She already knew.